Sir Frederick Handley Page slid a folded sheet across the walnut table at the Ministry of Supply on September 5, 1954, and told the assembled officials that Avro had produced the wrong answer to the wrong question. The question, drafted as Operational Requirement OR.1132, was how to keep Britain's nuclear deterrent airborne after Soviet surface-to-air missiles rendered high-altitude bombing suicidal. The Valiant, Victor and Vulcan, the V-Force taking shape at Wittering, Cottesmore and Waddington, would be obsolete within 5 years of entering service. Whitehall knew it. The air staff knew it. What they did not yet have was a standoff weapon capable of releasing 40 or 50 nautical miles from the target, letting the bomber turn away before Soviet radar operators at Baranovichi even resolved the contact. The Americans were working on the same problem and calling it GAM-77 Hound Dog, a large ramjet cruise missile slung under the wings of the B-52. North American Aviation had the contract, the budget, and the political weight of Curtis LeMay's Strategic Air Command behind them. In London, the contract went instead to Avro's Weapons Research Division at Woodford under Robert Lindley, with development authorized in March 1956 under the codename Blue Steel. The requirement was pitiless: Mach 2.5 at 70,000 feet, a range of at least 100 nautical miles, a thermonuclear warhead. The Red Snow device derived from the American W-28 under the terms of the 1958 Mutual Defense Agreement. And it had to fit under a Vulcan without wrecking the bomber's aerodynamics. Lindley's team chose a stainless steel airframe with canard foreplanes and a Bristol Siddeley Stentor twin-chamber rocket motor burning kerosene and high-test peroxide. High-test peroxide is a substance that dissolves human flesh on contact, ignites cotton overalls without a spark, and detonates if it touches copper. Our AF armourers at Scampton would eventually load it wearing PVC suits and full-face shields, working from behind blast screens. Every element of the weapon was harder than it needed to be, because British industry, having lost skilled toolmakers to emigration and being denied American guidance system data until 1958, was building everything from scratch: the inertial navigator, the astro tracker, the servo hydraulics, even the machine tools required to mill the airframe. The first free flight test at Woomera in the South Australian desert took place on June 4, 1959. The missile flew for 11 seconds and crashed. The second flew for 19 and crashed. The third flew for the full profile and was hailed inside Avro as vindication. Outside Avro, the Treasury was already asking whether the whole program should be cancelled and replaced with the American Skybolt, an air-launched ballistic missile that Douglas Aircraft was building for the USAF, and which Duncan Sandys, then Minister of Aviation, was privately championing. Blue Steel entered service with No. 617 Squadron at Scampton in February 1963. It was 10 months late, cost £60 million against an initial estimate of £2 million, and had a serviceability rate that hovered around 40% through its first year. The V-Force now had a weapon that could actually reach Moscow from a Vulcan flying a westbound arc over Norway. None of which explained why, in the autumn of 1964, a 5-man delegation from the United States Air Force Systems Command flew into RAF Scampton with clearance from the Pentagon to open every panel on the missile and file a classified report to Wright-Patterson. Skybolt had been cancelled 2 years earlier. Hound Dog was struggling. The Americans wanted to know what the British had actually built. The delegation was led by Colonel Warren Widehuner of the Aeronautical Systems Division at Wright-Patterson, accompanied by 2 propulsion specialists, a guidance engineer and a technical intelligence officer, whose brief was to compare Blue Steel component by component against Hound Dog. They arrived at Scampton on October 14, 1964, 3 days before Harold Wilson's Labour government took office, and were met by Air Vice Marshal Menol, senior air staff officer at Bomber Command, who had been briefed by the Cabinet Office to cooperate fully within the limits of the 1958 agreement. What the Americans expected to find was a competent second-tier weapon. The sort of thing a middle-ranking industrial power built when it could not buy the real article. What they found instead was documented in a report submitted to Air Force Systems Command Headquarters on December 3, 1964, portions of which were declassified in 1997 and are now held at the National Archives and Records Administration at College Park, with corresponding Ministry of Aviation files at Kew under AVIA 65. The report was, by the measured standards of USAF technical intelligence, extraordinary. It described the Stentor motor as of a sophistication significantly beyond current US practice in the storable liquid propellant field. It noted that the inertial navigation system built by Elliott Automation at Rochester achieved a circular error probable of under 800 meters at a range of 100 nautical miles. A figure hound dog, guided by an N5G astro-inertial system built by North American's own Autonetics division, could not match under operational conditions. North American Aviation, when the substance of the report reached their El Segundo offices in early 1965, through the usual USAF liaison channels, responded with predictable irritation. Hound Dog was 3 years older than Blue Steel, considerably larger, and carried a warhead, the W-28, of nearly twice the yield. The comparison was, they argued, unfair. Colonel Widehuner's response, recorded in a memorandum of February 11, 1965, held in the USAF Historical Research Agency files at Maxwell, was that the British had built a smaller missile with tighter guidance, a more compact propulsion system, and a warhead-to-weight ratio that suggested Aldermaston was doing something clever with the physics package that Los Alamos had not yet worked out. The last point was politically radioactive and was quietly excised from the version of the report that circulated beyond Air Force Systems Command. Inside Whitehall, none of this was known. The Ministry of Aviation had, by December 1964, been folded into the new Ministry of Technology under Frank Cousins, and the entire British aerospace establishment was bracing for the cancellations that would come in the 1965 Defence White Paper. TSR-2 on April 6th, HS-681 the same day, P-1154 6 weeks earlier. Blue Steel survived the cull because it was already deployed and because there was no alternative. The V-Force needed it until Polaris entered service. Dennis Healey, the new Secretary of State for Defence, received a briefing from the Chief of the Air Staff, Sir Charles Elworthy, on February 22, 1965, covering the strategic case for maintaining the airborne deterrent through the transition to submarines. The briefing note held at Kew under DEFE 13/450 does not mention the American assessment. Healey was not told that his obsolescent, over-budget, hydrogen peroxide-fueled embarrassment had just been described by Wright-Patterson as the most sophisticated standoff nuclear weapon in the Western inventory. He was told only that it worked, more or less, and that it would have to do until 1969. The submarine question was itself unresolved. Nassau had promised Polaris. Nassau had not delivered it. The Nassau Agreement of December 21, 1962, was Harold Macmillan's answer to a problem that had been building since Duncan Sandys committed Britain to Skybolt in March 1960. Skybolt was cancelled by Robert McNamara on November 7, 1962, in a decision announced without prior consultation with London, and Macmillan flew to the Bahamas to salvage what he could from what he described in his diary as a shattering blow. Kennedy offered Polaris the submarine-launched ballistic missile that the US Navy had deployed the previous year on USS George Washington, and Macmillan accepted, subject to Britain building its own warheads and its own submarines. The Royal Navy would join the Royal Air Force in the nuclear business, and the RAF would eventually get out of it. The first Resolution-class boat, HMS Resolution, was laid down at Vickers Armstrong's at Barrow-in-Furness on February 26, 1964. 3 sisters followed, Repulse, Renown, Revenge, at Barrow and at Camel Laird on Merseyside. Each carried 16 Polaris A-3 missiles in vertical tubes forward of the sail. Each missile carried 3 re-entry vehicles, each with a British-designed thermonuclear warhead, developed by the Atomic Weapons Research Establishment at Aldermaston. The re-entry vehicles were not independently targetable in the American sense. They were designed to land in a shotgun pattern around a single aim point, which was adequate for city busting but useless against Soviet missile silos hardened after 1964. Whitehall understood this. The question was what to do about it. The answer was Cheveline, and Cheveline was the reason Denis Healey's successors would spend the entire 1970s lying to Parliament. The programme began under Wilson's second government in 1967 as a study called Super Antelope, was renamed KH.793 by Edward Heath's administration in 1972, and became Cheveline under the Cabinet Committee, chaired by Lord Carrington. It was a re-entry system, not a new missile. The A3 airframe would carry a bus of decoys chaff and 2 hardened warheads designed to penetrate the ABM screen that the Soviets had built around Moscow. The Galosh system, of which 54 launchers were operational around the capital by 1970. The costs escalated in the way that British defence projects escalate. The initial 1972 estimate was £175 million. By 1977, it was £530 million. When Francis Pym, as Defence Secretary in Margaret Thatcher's first cabinet, finally announced Cheveline's existence to the House of Commons on January 24, 1980, the figure had reached £1 billion, and the missile still had not been tested at full range. Pym's statement was carefully drafted to avoid admitting that 4 successive governments, from Wilson to Callaghan, had concealed the programme's true cost from the Public Accounts Committee. Denis Healey, sitting on the opposition front bench, listened without comment. He had authorised the programme in 1974 as Chancellor, and knew perfectly well what the concealment had involved. The submarines themselves worked as advertised. Resolution sailed on her first deterrent patrol from Faslane on the Gareloch on June 15, 1968, 3 months after Blue Steel had been withdrawn from the strike role. The Vulcans thereafter carrying the WE-177 freefall bomb, which required them to overfly the target at low level, which is to say to die. From 1968 onwards, one Resolution-class boat was always at sea, always within range of Moscow, always under the operational command of an officer holding sealed instructions from the Prime Minister known as the Letter of Last Resort. The instructions were handwritten. Only the Prime Minister knew what they said. Roy Mason arrived at the Ministry of Defence on April 5, 1974, as Secretary of State for Defence in Harold Wilson's third administration, inheriting a department that was, by the internal accounting of the Treasury, spending £3.6 billion a year to defend a country whose gold and foreign currency reserves had been exhausted the previous November. The oil shock had quadrupled the price of Saudi crude between October 1973 and January 1974. Sterling was under pressure. The 3-day week had ended 6 weeks earlier. Mason's brief, delivered orally by Wilson at Chequers on April 7th, was to find £4.7 billion of cumulative savings over 10 years without withdrawing from NATO, without abandoning the Polaris deterrent, and without provoking a mutiny among the chiefs of staff. The Defence Review of 1974 to 75 was the third such exercise in a decade. Healey had conducted the first in 1966, the second in 1968, and it followed a pattern that had become depressingly familiar in Whitehall. The chiefs would present their minimum requirements. The Treasury would halve them. The Cabinet Office Assessment Staff, under Sir Percy Cradock's predecessor as chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee, would provide a threat assessment that supported whichever conclusion the Prime Minister had already reached. The savings would then be found by withdrawing from a theatre where the political cost was manageable. In 1966, that theatre had been east of Suez. In 1974, it was the Mediterranean, Southern Africa, and, critically, the surface fleet. Mason's review, announced to the Commons on December 3, 1974, cut the Royal Navy's escort force from around 70 frigates and destroyers to 50 by 1984, cancelled the through-deck cruiser Invincible's follow-on orders as a matter of principle if not yet of decision, and withdrew British forces from Malta, Mauritius, Gan in the Maldives, Simonstown in South Africa, and the Persian Gulf. The Army's commitment to BAOR, the British Army of the Rhine, was maintained at 55,000 troops on the specific insistence of Helmut Schmidt, who had made continued West German support for sterling contingent on the British staying in Germany. The Chiefs of Staff, chaired that year by Marshal of the RAF, Sir Andrew Humphrey, resisted. Admiral Sir Edward Ashmore, First Sea Lord, wrote a formal minute of dissent dated November 18, 1974, held at Kew under DEFE 24/81, arguing that the frigate cuts would leave the Eastern Atlantic Gap uncovered against the Soviet Northern Fleet's increasing submarine activity. The JIC's own assessment, JIC 7444 of October that year, had noted a 50% increase in Soviet ballistic missile submarine patrols in the Norwegian Sea over the preceding 18 months. Ashmore lost the argument. Mason had the Prime Minister's backing and the Treasury's numbers. The consequences reached the surface fleet within 4 years. When John Knott conducted the next defence review in 1981, HMS Endurance, the ice patrol ship that showed the flag around the Falklands and South Georgia, was scheduled for withdrawal in April 1982 as an economy measure. Lord Carrington at the Foreign Office objected in writing. Sir Henry Leach, the First Sea Lord who had replaced Ashmore, objected. Knott, backed by Thatcher, overruled them both. The Argentine junta, watching Whitehall for signals, drew the conclusion Whitehall had not intended to send. Galtieri's staff at the Casa Rosada in Buenos Aires began operational planning for the recapture of the Malvinas in December 1981. The Falklands Campaign lay 4 months in the future. Before it came the deployment that would test whether the frigate Navy Mason had cut and Knott had cut again, could still fight a war 8,000 miles from Portsmouth. The Joint Intelligence Committee met at Cabinet Office Briefing Room A on the morning of March 30th, 1982, under the chairmanship of Sir Anthony Duff, a former Deputy Secretary at the Foreign Office who had succeeded Sir Anthony Ackland the previous year. The papers before the committee were unusually thin. GCHQ at Cheltenham had picked up increased Argentine naval signals traffic across the preceding week, particularly from the Puerto Belgrano headquarters of Almirante Anaya. But the traffic was in codes that GCHQ's Argentine section, small, under-resourced and reliant on cooperation with the American NSA that had not been forthcoming, could not read in real time. SIS's station in Buenos Aires, run by an officer under Second Secretary cover at the embassy, had reported on March 24th that the junta was considering military action against the Malvinas, but could not specify a date. The JIC's assessment, JIC 8216, concluded that an Argentine invasion was possible but not imminent. Duff's covering note to Thatcher, timed at 11:40, stated that no invasion is likely before the winter. The winter meant the southern winter, June or later. The invasion began 48 hours later. The failure was not one of raw intelligence but of assessment, and it had a specific cause. The JIC had been reassuring ministers for 18 months that the Argentines would not invade, because the Argentines had not invaded during the previous crisis, in 1977, when Callahan's government had quietly sent a nuclear submarine, HMS Dreadnought, to the South Atlantic and let the Argentines know it. The assumption baked into every subsequent assessment was that deterrence was working. Deterrence was not working. Deterrence had stopped working the moment Knott announced Endurance's withdrawal, and the British Nationality Act 1981 removed the right of Falkland Islanders to reside in the United Kingdom, both signals that the junta read as a British loss of interest in the islands. Nicholas Henderson, the ambassador in Washington, received the news at his residence on Massachusetts Avenue at 4 o'clock in the morning local time on April 2nd, 1982, and telephoned Alexander Haig at the State Department before Haig had reached his office. Henderson's request was for immediate American public support and for satellite intelligence on Argentine naval dispositions. He received the second, The first KH-11 imagery reached Northwood by April 5th, routed through Cheltenham. But the first was withheld for 3 weeks while Haig attempted to mediate between London and Buenos Aires. Jeane Kirkpatrick, the US ambassador to the United Nations, attended a dinner at the Argentine embassy in Washington on the evening of April 2nd, a decision that Henderson raised formally with the State Department and privately with Reagan's National Security Advisor, Judge William Clark. The task force sailed from Portsmouth on April 5th, HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible, the two carriers that Knott's review had almost cancelled, with a combined air group of 20 Sea Harriers from 800 and 801 naval air squadrons. Sir Henry Leach, who had told Thatcher on March 31st in her Commons room that he could assemble a task force by the weekend if she gave the order that evening, had been operating on the assumption that the political will existed. He had been correct. The Prime Minister had given the order in principle before the Cabinet had formally approved the deployment. The submarines had sailed earlier. HMS Splendid left Faslane on April 1st, HMS Spartan on March 30th, HMS Conqueror from her home port on April 4th. Their orders, transmitted from Northwood in the naval message format known as Signal, established the maritime exclusion zone in the South Atlantic and, critically, assigned Conqueror to track the Argentine cruiser General Belgrano, which had sailed from Ushuaia on April 26th with 2 Exocet armed destroyers in company. The rules of engagement Conqueror carried on May 2nd allowed her to attack only within the exclusion zone. Belgrano was outside it and heading away. Commander Christopher Reeford Brown of HMS Conqueror had been tracking Belgrano and her escorts, Piedrabuena and Ippolito Bouchard, since the early hours of May 1st. His signals to Northwood requested authorization to engage before the target reached shallower water off Birdwood Bank, where a nuclear submarine would be at a serious tactical disadvantage. The signals reached the Chief of the Defence Staff, Admiral of the Fleet Sir Terence Lewin, who took them to the War Cabinet meeting held at Chequers on the afternoon of Sunday, May 2nd, 1982. The Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary Francis Pym, the Defence Secretary John Knott, the Home Secretary William Whitelaw, and Cecil Parkinson as Paymaster General were present, together with Sir Michael Havers as Attorney General, Sir Robert Armstrong as Cabinet Secretary, and Lewin himself. Lewin's request was for a change to the rules of engagement to permit attack on Argentine naval vessels outside the exclusion zone. His argument, recorded in the Franks Report of January 1983 and expanded in his 1987 papers now held at Churchill College, Cambridge, was that Belgrano was manoeuvring, that her course and speed were tactical rather than strategic indicators, and that once she reached shallow water, Conqueror might lose her. The alternative was to wait until the cruiser was attacking the task force, by which time it would be too late. The Cabinet approved the change at 13:30. Havers had confirmed that the change was consistent with Article 51 of the UN Charter on Self-Defense. Reeford Brown received the amended ROE at 17:30 Greenwich Mean Time, 14:30 local time in the South Atlantic, and fired 3 Mark 8 torpedoes at Belgrano at 19:57 Greenwich Mean Time. 2 hit. The cruiser sank in 45 minutes. 323 Argentine sailors died, most of them conscripts under 20. The Argentine fleet returned to port and did not sortie again for the duration of the war. The political fight over the sinking began within 24 hours. Tam Dalyell, the Labour MP for West Lothian, pursued the matter in the Commons for the next 3 years, alleging that Belgrano had been on a course away from the task force, which she had been on a westerly heading of 270 degrees at approximately 11 knots, and that the sinking was therefore a political act designed to sabotage the Peruvian peace proposals, then being transmitted by President Belaúnde Terry. The peace proposals had reached the Foreign Office at 23:15 on May 1st, more than 18 hours before the Cabinet's decision. Clive Ponting, a senior civil servant at the Ministry of Defence, would later be prosecuted under the Official Secrets Act for leaking documents on the sinking to Dalyell in 1984. A jury acquitted him in February 1985 despite the trial judge's direction that he had no defense in law. The military logic held. The political logic was harder to defend. Whether Belgrano's westerly course represented a genuine withdrawal or a tactical loop preparatory to a pincer attack on the task force from the southwest was a question the Argentine naval staff itself could not have answered on May 2nd, because Admiral Anaya had not yet decided. Belgrano's captain, Hector Bonzo, would state after the war that his orders were to attack if opportunity arose. That was consistent with the cabinet's assessment. It was also consistent with Dalyell's argument that no immediate threat existed. Both statements were true. The war shifted decisively on May 4th, 2 days after Belgrano sank. HMS Sheffield, a Type 42 destroyer on radar picket duty, 70 nautical miles southeast of the task force, detected two super-etendards approaching at low level from the west at 1100 local time. The Exocet struck at 11:04. The Sheffield burned for 6 days before she sank. 20 men died in the initial strike. The missile did not detonate, but its unspent fuel ignited an inferno that the ship's damage control parties, working with breathing apparatus in acrid black smoke, could not contain. The lessons reached the Ministry of Defence in a series of urgent signals from Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward, commander of the task group, addressed to Northwood, and copied to CDS. Aluminium superstructures burned. PVC insulated cabling produced toxic smoke. The Type 42's Sea Dart missile system, designed to engage high-altitude Soviet bombers over the Norwegian Sea, could not lock onto a target flying at 15 feet above the sea. Every one of these problems had been identified in previous exercises. None had been corrected because correcting them would have cost money the Treasury had not been willing to spend. The war was won regardless. San Carlos on May 21st, Goose Green on May 28th and 29th with 2 para under Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Jones. Jones, killed leading an attack on an Argentine trench near Darwin, awarded a posthumous Victoria Cross, and the Long Yomp across East Falkland to the ring of hills west of Stanley, Mount Longdon, 2 Sisters, Mount Harriet, and finally Wireless Ridge and Mount Tumbledown on the night of June 13th to 14th. Brigadier Julian Thompson of 3 Commando Brigade and Major General Jeremy Moore, who had taken overall land command on May 30th, orchestrated a campaign that succeeded despite the loss of 3,000 tons of stores and helicopters, when the Atlantic conveyor was hit by an Exocet on May 25th. General Menendez surrendered at Stanley on June 14th. 255 British servicemen had died. 649 Argentines had died. 3 Falkland Islanders, all women, had died in a naval gunfire accident on June 11th. Thatcher's victory speech at the Cheltenham Conservative rally on July 3, 1982, declared that Britain had ceased to be a nation in retreat, a formulation drafted by Ronald Miller and worked over by the Prime Minister herself into the small hours of July 2nd. The domestic political consequences reshaped British politics for a decade. The military consequences reshaped Whitehall assessments of what a medium-sized power with residual global commitments could still, at the extreme edge of feasibility, do. The Cold War had been the constant backdrop. Throughout the campaign, Soviet reconnaissance satellites tracked the task force's movements and passed the data to the Argentine junta through Cuban intermediaries. A channel identified by GCHQ from signals intercepts and confirmed by SIGINT sharing with the Americans once Reagan authorized full cooperation on April 30th. NATO's Central Front had not been degraded. BAOR remained at strength. The Rhine Army's 4 divisions and Royal Air Force Germany's Harrier and Jaguar squadrons continued their normal exercise pattern under SACEUR's operational control, and the JIC continued to assess Soviet intentions in Central Europe as the primary threat. The primary threat in the Kremlin's own assessment was Reagan. The Strategic Defense Initiative announced on March 23, 1983 was received in Moscow as evidence, false but internally coherent, that the Americans were preparing for a nuclear first strike under the cover of a defensive shield. Yuri Andropov, the former KGB chairman who had succeeded Brezhnev in November 1982, had already ordered Operation RYAN in May 1981, a KGB and GRU collection effort designed to detect Western preparations for nuclear war. The intelligence Andropov received was distorted by the demands of the collection requirement. His officers reported what he expected to hear. Oleg Gordievsky returned to London in June 1982 as a line PR officer at the Soviet Embassy in Kensington Palace Gardens, having been recruited by SIS in Copenhagen 8 years earlier. His controllers at Century House assigned him a case officer, a communications channel, and a set of standing requirements that included any indication that Moscow Center believed nuclear war to be imminent. Between November 1982 and November 1983, Gordievsky provided SIS with material that fundamentally changed the Joint Intelligence Committee's assessment of Soviet nuclear posture, and through liaison with the Americans, changed Reagan's own understanding of what he was doing. The Able Archer 83 exercise ran from 2 to 11 November 1983 across NATO's central region. It rehearsed the release procedures for theater nuclear weapons under a scenario of escalating conflict in Central Europe. The exercise was more realistic than its predecessors in several specific ways. It involved participation by heads of government at the political consultation stage. It used new communications formats that Soviet SIGINT had not previously observed, and it included a change to NATO's defense condition levels. The KGB residencies in London, Bonn, Paris, and Washington were all reporting to Moscow under the RYAN framework, and their reports, filtered through officers who understood what Andropov wanted to see, described a possible NATO first strike in preparation. Gordievsky's material, meeting his SIS handler in a safe house in Bayswater on November 11, 1983, reported that Moscow Center was seriously considering the possibility that the exercise was cover for an actual attack. Soviet air units in East Germany and Poland went to increased alert. Nuclear-capable aircraft at bases in the western military districts were placed on higher readiness. The JIC, chaired now by Sir Percy Cradock, prepared an urgent assessment for the Prime Minister dated May 8, 1984, JIC 84-18, that concluded the Soviet leadership's fear of surprise attack was genuine, and that Western behavior needed adjustment to reduce the risk of miscalculation. Thatcher accepted the assessment. Her speech at the Winston Churchill Foundation dinner in Washington on February 20, 1985, argued for engagement with what she called the new generation of Soviet leaders, a phrase directed at Mikhail Gorbachev, whom she had met at Chequers on December 16, 1984, and about whom she had made her famous remark, "I like Mr. Gorbachev. We can do business together," to the BBC on the drive back to London. The remark was neither spontaneous nor uncalculated. Charles Powell, her Foreign Affairs private secretary, had drafted talking points based on JIC assessments, prepared with Gordievsky's material at their core. The last 5 years of the Cold War played out with Britain acting as broker between Washington and Moscow, a role Whitehall had wanted since 1945 and had never previously secured. Geoffrey Howe met Eduard Shevardnadze at the Foreign Office on July 6, 1988, discussing arms control terms that the Americans would formally negotiate at Reykjavik and Washington. Thatcher visited Moscow in March 1987, walking through Gum department store with a BBC crew, filming what was, by KGB standards, the most successful piece of foreign propaganda ever conducted against the Soviet state. Gordievsky was exfiltrated from Moscow on July 20, 1985, driven across the Finnish border in the boot of a British diplomatic car after Aldrich Ames, a CIA officer who had begun spying for the KGB in April 1985, betrayed him. The operation was run by SIS's Moscow station without American knowledge, precisely because Ames's treachery was suspected, but not yet proven. The Warsaw Pact dissolved on July 1st, 1991. The Soviet Union dissolved on December 25th that year. Blue Steel retired from service on December 31st, 1970, had by then been in a museum for 2 decades. What Wright-Patterson had said about it in 1964 was still classified.